Welcome to Slumber Scrolls, where history whispers you to sleep. Tonight, we're stepping into a moment where silence mattered more than speeches, where one decision reshaped an entire world, and where a man acted not for glory, but because he believed something precious was slipping away. This is not a story of shouting crowds or clashing armies. It's a story of hesitation, of private thoughts, of long nights spent weighing duty against loyalty. A story about Marcus Brutus, remembered as a betrayer, yet driven by a fear that power, once gathered, rarely gives itself back. As you settle in, let the noise of the day fall away. You don't need to remember every name or date. Just listen. Let the rhythm carry you through ancient streets, quiet chambers, and candle-lit rooms where choices were made that could never be undone. This story moves slowly. It asks no questions of you. It offers no simple answers. Only a calm path through the thoughts of a man standing at the edge of change, unsure whether action would save the world he loved or end it. Get comfortable, breathe deeply, and when you're ready, let the story begin. There's a strange moment in history when a person becomes smaller than a phrase, and yet more famous than an empire. 3 words can do that, not because they're perfectly true, but because they feel true enough to stick. And for nearly 2,000 years, Brutus has lived inside that sticky feeling. The name Brutus doesn't land in your mind like a biography. It lands like a verdict. But tonight, I want to slow the whole thing down. Not to excuse him, not to praise him, just to understand what kind of world can produce a man who convinces himself that killing his friend is the price of freedom. Because here's the uncomfortable twist. Brutus wasn't a knife-happy gangster in a dark alley. He wasn't a chaotic rebel who wanted to watch Rome burn. He was, by the standards of his class, a respectable Roman. Educated, serious, controlled. The kind of man who would rather read and reflect than shout in a crowd. The kind of man who didn't lead with charm, but with a certain quiet gravity. And that's exactly why his story still unsettles people. In Rome, the Republic was more than a government. It was a religion of habit. It was a rhythm. Elections, offices, speeches, traditions, ritual gestures, ancient rules, and constant negotiation. Rome loved to tell itself that it had expelled kings long ago, that it would never kneel to a crown again, that power belonged to law, not to bloodlines. And yet, by the time Brutus was born, everyone could feel it. The Republic was standing, but it was shaking. This was a Rome where the Senate still talked as if it controlled everything. But generals controlled armies, and armies controlled outcomes. It was a Rome where elections existed, but money and patronage could bend them. It was a Rome where the people mattered, yet also didn't, because their hunger, their anger, and their loyalty could be managed with grain, games, and promises. And in that uneasy Rome, Brutus was born into something heavier than wealth. He was born into a name. The Juni were old, respected, and drenched in legend. His family traced its prestige back to a semi-mythic ancestor, Lucius Junius Brutus, celebrated as the man who helped push out the last Roman king and helped set the Republic in motion. Rome loved that story. It was told like a sacred origin tale. The Republic was born when brave men refused to tolerate tyranny. Now imagine growing up with that shadow behind you. Imagine being reminded, sometimes directly and sometimes through whispers, that your bloodline carries a duty. That your family isn't just noble, it's symbolic. That your ancestors are remembered not for comfort, but for resistance. That your surname is a political message. And then, to complicate everything, Brutus's personal life didn't begin with stability. His father was killed in Rome's vicious political violence, and the world around Brutus taught him early that the Republic, this system of laws, could still execute, still purge, still crush people when power shifted. That kind of childhood does something to you. It plants a hard question in your mind. Is the Republic a guardian of liberty? Or is it just a machine that powerful men take turns driving? As Brutus grew, one influence became especially important: Cato the Younger. Cato wasn't just a politician, he was a moral performance. A man famous for discipline, for strict virtue, for stubborn resistance, for living as if Rome's ancient ideals mattered more than survival. If you wanted a living symbol of the old Republic, Cato was it. And Brutus admired him intensely. Ancient biographers, especially Plutarch, paint Brutus as someone who looked up to Cato like a North Star, an example of what a Roman should be when the world becomes morally slippery. And it wasn't only Roman tradition that shaped him. Brutus loved Greek learning. He studied philosophy. He leaned toward Plato. He moved in an elite world where educated Romans often spoke Greek fluently, read Greek works, and treated Greek thought like a mirror for their own political anxieties. You can think of it like this. When Rome started losing confidence in its institutions, its upper class went searching for stable principles. Some found them in ancestral tradition. Others found them in philosophy. Brutus, quietly, intensely, wanted both. That combination is important because it creates a particular kind of person, someone who believes morality should be clean, consistent, and logical, even when the world is not. And so Brutus grew into adulthood with a powerful internal storyline. Rome is supposed to be free, kings are poison, and noble men have a duty to guard the Republic. But history rarely gives you a simple test. It gives you a messy one. Because while Brutus was building a mind shaped by ideals, Rome was being reshaped by personalities. The late Republic didn't collapse because of one villain. It collapsed because it became a stage crowded with giants: Pompey, Crassus, Cicero, Caesar, and each one carried a different version of Rome in his head. To many ordinary Romans, Caesar looked like the man who could fix a broken world. He was bold, brilliant, and, most dangerously, popular. He had the kind of presence that makes people forgive what they would condemn in someone else. He could commit an outrage and make it feel like progress. He could break a norm and call it necessity. To many senators, Caesar looked like a disaster waiting to be crowned. And Brutus lived in the middle of those perceptions. And it's worth saying this clearly, early, before we get to the knives and the speeches. Brutus didn't wake up one morning and decide to become a villain. He moved step by step, thought by thought, compromise by compromise, towards something that later generations would call either noble or unforgivable. Even the famous line that chained his name to betrayal, et tu, Brute, is part of that long afterlife, not a clean historical fact. Ancient sources don't agree on what Caesar said, or whether he said anything at all. Suetonius, for example, reports that Caesar's will later gave the Roman people his gardens near the Tiber and 300 sesterces each. Details that mattered because they show how strongly Caesar understood public affection and public memory. But the neat, perfect et tu, Brute comes to most people through Shakespeare, where it lands like a curse and a heartbreak at the same time. That's the power of storytelling. It can become more famous than the event itself, and in a way, that's exactly what we're exploring in this series. Not just what Brutus did, but how his world pushed him toward a role that history was hungry to assign. So as we move forward, I want you to keep noticing two Brutuses at once. There's the Brutus of ideals, the man raised on the Republic, trained in philosophy, shaped by ancestral legends about driving out kings. And there's the Brutus of real life, the Roman aristocrat operating inside patronage networks, political deals, ambition, fear, and a system that rewarded power even while pretending to worship law. Those two versions of him were always going to collide. And when they did, the collision wouldn't only wound Caesar, it would wound the Republic itself, maybe fatally. So in the next part, we'll step into the Republic as Brutus actually experienced it, not as a romantic idea, but as a working machine. You'll see why men like Brutus could genuinely believe they were saving Rome, even as Rome was already sliding toward something it couldn't reverse. If you want to understand Brutus, you don't start with the daggers. You start with the rules, and the quiet terror of watching them stop working. Rome liked to pretend that its rules were eternal. Senators spoke about tradition as if it were stone, as if the Republic had been designed once and would simply keep working forever. But by the time Brutus reached adulthood, the Republic felt less like stone and more like wood, old, creaking, held together by habit and hope rather than strength. On paper, the system still looked impressive. There were magistracies with clear names and ranks, quaestors, praetors, consuls. There was the Senate, filled with men who believed themselves to be the guardians of Roman wisdom. There were assemblies where citizens could vote. There were laws stacked on laws, precedents layered upon precedents. Rome loved paperwork, rituals, and procedures. In practice, though, power had drifted. The Senate could debate, but it could not command armies. Magistrates could hold office, but their influence faded the moment their term ended. Generals, on the other hand, kept loyalty long after their official titles expired, because soldiers followed men, not documents, and this imbalance created a quiet panic among Rome's elite. Everyone could sense it, even if few admitted it out loud. Brutus grew up inside that anxiety. As a young aristocrat, his path was shaped by expectations more than freedom. Roman political life was not about self-discovery. It was about service, reputation, and alignment. Who sponsored you mattered. Who mentored you mattered. Who owed you favors mattered. Even ideals moved through networks. Patronage was the bloodstream of the Republic. Senators backed younger men, not out of kindness, but because those men would later vote, speak, and act in ways that strengthened their patrons. Debts, financial and political, were everywhere. A favor granted today could demand repayment years later, at exactly the wrong moment. Brutus learned this early. He wasn't naive about how Rome worked. He knew that public virtue often wore private strings. Even his own family history showed it. His father had held office, aligned himself with a losing faction, and paid with his life. That lesson never left Brutus. Ideals alone did not protect you. Timing and alliances mattered. Yet Brutus still believed that the Republic was worth protecting, even if it was flawed. To him, the system wasn't broken beyond repair, it was under threat. And threats, in Roman thinking, demanded firm responses. This belief placed him in an uncomfortable position during the great power struggles of his time. Rome wasn't divided simply between good and bad men. It was divided between different visions of stability. Pompey represented order through authority, Caesar represented order through charisma, and the Senate represented order through tradition. None of these paths were clean. When the alliance between Caesar, Pompey, and Crassus collapsed, Rome didn't just lose political balance, it lost its illusion of cooperation. Once Crassus died and Caesar and Pompey turned against each other, everyone else was forced to choose. Neutrality stopped being an option. For Brutus, this choice was especially painful. Pompey was the man responsible for his father's death. Caesar, on the other hand, treated Brutus with unusual respect. There were rumors, uncomfortable ones, about Caesar's relationship with Brutus's mother, Servilia. Ancient writers loved to whisper that Caesar might even be Brutus's real father, though timelines make that unlikely. Still, the rumor mattered. It meant people assumed a personal bond, whether or not it truly existed. And yet, when war came, Brutus sided with Pompey. This wasn't a choice driven by affection. It was driven by fear of what Caesar represented. To Brutus, Caesar wasn't just another ambitious Roman. He was something new. A man whose popularity made resistance dangerous. A man who could break rules and be applauded for it. A man who could march an army into Italy and still claim legitimacy. Crossing the Rubicon was more than a military act. It was a psychological one. It told Rome that law would now follow power, not the other way around. And once that happened, the Republic's logic began to unravel. Brutus joined Pompey's camp with reluctance, not enthusiasm. Ancient sources describe him as thoughtful, reserved, even uncomfortable in military life. He wasn't a natural battlefield leader. He didn't inspire troops with fiery speeches or reckless courage. His strength lay elsewhere, in judgment, in restraint, in reflection. That contrast mattered. Roman military culture valued decisiveness and boldness. Caesar excelled at this. He rewarded loyalty, shared hardship, and made his soldiers feel personally invested in his success. Brutus, by comparison, was distant. Not cruel, not arrogant, just cerebral. He commanded respect, but not devotion. And yet, both Caesar and Pompey treated him with care. Pompey welcomed him warmly when he joined the camp. Caesar, even more strikingly, instructed his officers to spare Brutus if he were captured. This wasn't normal. Civil wars are not gentle affairs. The fact that Brutus was protected by both sides shows how symbolic he already was. The war itself moved quickly. Caesar defeated Pompey at Pharsalus, and with that battle, the outcome was largely settled. Pompey fled, only to be murdered in Egypt. The Republic's last great defender, at least in name, was gone. Brutus survived. And this survival changed everything. Instead of being punished, Brutus was forgiven. Caesar welcomed him, elevated him, placed him back into public life. This is one of the most important turning points in Brutus's story, because it created a moral trap. Caesar's mercy looked generous, even noble, but it also placed Brutus under obligation. Roman society took favors seriously. When a powerful man spared you, promoted you, trusted you, that created a bond stronger than law. Gratitude wasn't optional. Loyalty was expected. For Brutus, this created a silent conflict. He could not deny Caesar's competence. He could not deny that Caesar brought order where chaos had ruled, but he also watched Caesar accumulate honors, titles, and authority in ways that bypassed the Republic's traditional limits. At first, these moves were tolerable. A long-term dictatorship could be framed as emergency medicine. Rome had accepted dictators before in times of crisis. The problem was not the title itself. The problem was momentum. Caesar's power kept growing, and the system kept adjusting to accommodate him. Senators applauded, crowds cheered, statues appeared, calendars were revised. The center of gravity shifted from institutions to a person. This terrified men like Brutus, not because Caesar was cruel, but because he was effective. An ineffective tyrant can be resisted. A popular one reshapes the world before opposition can organize. Brutus began to feel that Rome was drifting toward a future where law existed only by Caesar's permission. And this is where psychology enters the story. Brutus wasn't plotting murder yet. He was rationalizing concern. He was watching precedents form. He was noticing how easily the Republic bent under pressure. Every honor granted to Caesar made the next one easier. Every silence from the Senate taught the people that silence was normal. Brutus believed that systems don't collapse all at once. They slide. And once they slide far enough, stopping them requires force. This belief didn't make him bloodthirsty. It made him tense. He began to see himself not as Caesar's enemy, but as Rome's insurance policy. A man waiting, hoping that things would stabilize, and fearing that they would not. And so Rome entered a strange calm. The war was over. Caesar ruled. Brutus held office. The Republic still existed in name. But underneath it all, a question pulsed quietly through the Senate like a headache that wouldn't go away. If one man could hold this much power now, what would stop him from holding it forever? That question didn't yet have an answer. But it was about to demand one. If Brutus had been asked to explain himself at this stage of his life, he probably wouldn't have spoken about Caesar at all. He would have spoken about duty, about balance, about the quiet weight of responsibility that comes with being born into a republic that constantly tells you it survived because certain men at certain moments chose restraint over comfort. That idea sat at the center of his mind, and much of it came from one man more than any other: Cato the Younger. Cato was not warm. He was not flexible. He was not popular in the way Caesar was popular. But he was respected in a way that felt older, almost austere. To many Romans, Cato represented a moral memory. He lived simply, spoke bluntly, refused bribes, resisted compromise, and treated public office as a burden rather than a prae. In a city increasingly dazzled by spectacle and personality, Cato was deliberately plain. And that plainness became a form of protest. Brutus admired him deeply. Ancient writers make it clear that this admiration wasn't casual. It shaped how Brutus thought about himself. Where Caesar taught Romans how power could be wielded, Cato taught Brutus how power should be endured. But Cato's influence wasn't limited to Roman tradition. Through Cato and through his own studies, Brutus absorbed Stoic philosophy. Stoicism wasn't about emotional coldness, as it's often misunderstood today. It was about self-mastery, about aligning one's actions with reason and virtue regardless of personal cost. A Stoic believed that external events, wealth, status, even life itself, were less important than moral consistency. That belief can be comforting. It can also be dangerous. Because once you convince yourself that virtue outweighs consequences, you may accept outcomes that others would find unbearable. Suffering becomes proof of righteousness. Loss becomes evidence of commitment, and compromise starts to look like weakness. Alongside Stoicism, Brutus also carried the influence of Greek political thought, especially Plato. Plato's ideas about tyranny were well known among Roman elites. A tyrant, in this tradition, wasn't just a cruel ruler. He was someone whose unchecked power corrupted the moral order of the state. A tyrant reshaped laws to suit himself. He trained people to obey rather than judge. He replaced civic virtue with loyalty to a person. These ideas weren't abstract to Brutus. They felt painfully relevant. He looked around Rome and saw a city drifting toward comfort with concentration of power. He saw senators who once argued fiercely now applauding politely. He saw laws bending to fit one man's needs. He saw public gratitude slowly transforming into dependence. And yet, here's the twist that makes Brutus so difficult to judge. Caesar wasn't acting like a villain. He wasn't shutting down debate entirely. He wasn't ruling through terror. He spoke of reform, stability, and unity. He presented himself as Rome's solution, not its master. Many ordinary Romans genuinely felt that life was improving under his leadership. This created a moral paradox for Brutus. If tyranny arrives screaming, it's easy to resist. If it arrives smiling, it's harder to name. Brutus began to feel trapped between two kinds of loyalty. One loyalty was personal and immediate. Caesar had forgiven him. Caesar had trusted him. Caesar had elevated him. In Roman culture, gratitude was not optional. It was a moral expectation. The other loyalty was abstract and older. It was loyalty to the Republic as an idea, not the Republic as it actually functioned day to day, but as it was supposed to function, as a system where no single man mattered more than the law, as a shared project rather than a personal brand. These loyalties were pulling him in opposite directions, and there was no clean way to satisfy both. Brutus tried, for a while, to live inside the tension. He accepted offices. He performed his duties. He didn't openly oppose Caesar. He didn't openly support radical action either. He waited. Like many Romans, he hoped that things would stabilize on their own. That Caesar would eventually step back. That extraordinary power would return to ordinary limits. But Rome was not built to rewind itself. Every new honor given to Caesar made stepping back less likely. Every title normalized the next one. When Caesar accepted the role of dictator for life, it wasn't just a legal move, it was a psychological one. It told Rome that emergency had no expiration date. To men like Brutus, that was the moment when hope began to curdle into fear. This is also where gendered expectations of Roman masculinity come into play. Roman elites believed that a man proved his worth through public action. Silence in the face of danger could be read as cowardice. Endurance mattered, but so did intervention. If the Republic was truly under threat, then failing to act might itself be immoral. Brutus began to feel watched, not necessarily by people, but by history, by his ancestors, by the expectations attached to his name. He knew the stories Rome told about Lucius Junius Brutus, the man who expelled the kings. He knew how Romans celebrated those who acted decisively against perceived tyranny, and he also knew how Rome treated those who hesitated. At the same time, another force was pressing in from the outside, other senators. Men who were less restrained than Brutus. Men who were angrier, more jealous, more personally threatened by Caesar's dominance. Cassius, in particular, represented a different energy. Where Brutus was reflective, Cassius was sharp-edged. He didn't cloak his resentment in philosophy. He spoke openly about loss of status, blocked advancement, humiliation. Cassius saw Caesar as an obstacle. Brutus saw Caesar as a problem. That difference matters. Cassius pushed. Brutus resisted. Cassius argued in terms of danger and opportunity. Brutus argued in terms of principle. Ancient sources suggest that without Brutus's participation, the conspiracy might never have gained moral credibility. His name gave it legitimacy. His hesitation gave it gravity. This is where group psychology begins to tighten its grip. When people with similar anxieties talk to each other repeatedly, their fears can begin to feel like facts. Doubts turn into shared certainties. Moral lines become easier to cross when others reassure you that you're crossing them for the right reasons. Brutus didn't suddenly decide that Caesar must die. He gradually accepted the idea that Caesar's continued life was incompatible with the Republic's survival. That distinction mattered deeply to him. It allowed him to frame violence not as revenge, but as necessity. And yet, even as this reasoning hardened, Brutus insisted on limits. He rejected proposals to kill Caesar's allies. He argued against purges. He wanted the act to appear surgical, restrained, almost reluctant. In his mind, this would preserve the moral high ground. It's a haunting thought. Brutus believed that moderation could coexist with assassination. As these ideas formed, Rome itself grew restless. Omens were reported, rumors spread. Graffiti appeared praising old tyrant slayers and quietly mocking Caesar's ambition. Whether these messages came from the people or from elites whispering to each other hardly mattered. They created an atmosphere where decisive action felt not only possible, but expected. Brutus stood at the center of that atmosphere, increasingly isolated inside his own reasoning. The more he thought, the more trapped he felt. If he did nothing, he believed he would be betraying the Republic. If he acted, he would betray a man who had trusted him. This is the emotional pressure cooker that forged the Brutus history remembers. Not hatred, not madness, but a man convinced that he was running out of time and that history would not forgive hesitation. In the next part, we'll watch how that pressure turns into planning, how private reasoning becomes shared resolve, and how a group of senators convinces itself that one violent moment can reset the course of an entire civilization. By the time Brutus reached what looked, from the outside, like success, his life had already begun to reveal a quieter contradiction. He was respected, educated, and increasingly visible in Roman public life. Yet, beneath that respectable surface, his choices exposed the tension between ideals and reality, between the republic he admired and the Rome that actually existed. Publicly, Brutus appeared exactly as a Roman noble should. He held offices appropriate to his rank. He moved carefully, spoke with restraint, and avoided the theatrical displays that defined more flamboyant figures of the age. He did not shout like Cicero, posture like Pompey, or dazzle like Caesar. His authority came from seriousness. People listened to him because he seemed thoughtful, measured, and principled. But Rome had a way of testing principles. One of the clearest tests came far from the Forum, in the provinces. Roman expansion had created a vast Mediterranean world tied together by conquest, taxation, and opportunity. Provinces like Cilicia, Cyprus, and parts of Asia Minor were not just administrative zones. They were financial ecosystems where Roman elites could make or break fortunes. Governors, assistants, and financiers moved through these regions with legal authority and moral flexibility. Brutus was no exception. Early in his career, he served under his uncle Cato in Cyprus, assisting with provincial administration. Ancient sources sometimes praise Brutus for helping convert royal treasure into usable funds for Rome, framing it as efficiency and responsibility. But efficiency in the provinces often came with a darker edge. Roman law officially restricted exploitation. In practice, enforcement was selective, and influence mattered more than ethics. Later, Brutus became involved in money-lending operations in the East, particularly in the city of Salamis on Cyprus. This episode would haunt his reputation, not because it was unique, but because it revealed how even men of principle navigated Rome's economic machinery. The loan in question carried an astonishing interest rate, reportedly around 48% annually. By any standard, even Roman ones, this was harsh. Cicero, serving as governor in the region at the time, was deeply uncomfortable with the situation. His letters show a man torn between legal obligation, moral unease, and political friendship. He didn't want to anger Brutus. He also didn't want to enforce what looked like legalized extortion. This matters because it punctures a comforting myth. Brutus was not a pure philosopher floating above Rome's dirtier realities. He understood profit. He benefited from the system. He knew how influence worked. And he was willing, at times, to push boundaries when it served his interests. This doesn't make him a hypocrite in a simple sense. It makes him Roman. The Republic trained its elites to believe that virtue and advantage could coexist. A man could speak of liberty in the Senate and still squeeze a province for revenue. These behaviors were not seen as contradictions. They were seen as different arenas of life. Public morality and private benefit lived side by side. Still, for Brutus, these experiences left marks. They showed him that Rome's ideals were already compromised long before Caesar concentrated power in his hands. The Republic was not a fragile innocent corrupted by one man. It was a system that often rewarded sharp practice while preaching restraint. And yet, Brutus didn't conclude that the Republic was beyond saving. Instead, he concluded that it needed guarding, perhaps even correction. As his career advanced, so did his visibility. Caesar, who valued capable men and knew how to bind them to himself, continued to favor Brutus. He supported his appointments. He placed him in positions of trust. From the outside, it looked like a success story. Former enemies reconciled, talent recognized, unity restored after civil war. Inside Brutus's mind, however, the tension sharpened. Every promotion carried an unspoken message. Your future is secure if you stay aligned. Caesar didn't demand open worship, but his system quietly rewarded compliance. Rome's political life had shifted from collective negotiation to personal alignment. You didn't ask, "What does the Senate want?" as much as, "What does Caesar think?" Brutus could feel that shift even if he didn't say it aloud. This is also where Rome's culture of honor plays a crucial role. Roman masculinity wasn't defined only by courage in battle. It was defined by reputation, by the judgment of peers, by whether one's actions aligned with ancestral expectations. To accept favors from a dominant figure without question risked appearing weak, dependent, or compromised. Brutus walked a tightrope. He needed Caesar's support to function politically, but he feared that too much proximity would erase the independence his name implied. At the same time, Rome's social climate was growing louder. People talked, senators whispered, Public messages appeared in unexpected places. Graffiti referencing ancient defenders of liberty began to circulate. Statues were adorned or defaced in symbolic ways. These acts were not random. They were signals, coded messages in a city fluent in symbolism. Brutus couldn't ignore them. Others made sure he didn't. Cassius and like-minded senators continued to probe him. They framed their concerns carefully. They spoke of tradition, of precedent, of Rome's hatred of kingship. They reminded Brutus of his lineage. They suggested that history was watching. None of this sounded like a call to violence, at least not at first. It sounded like civic concern. And that made it harder to dismiss. At this stage, Brutus still resisted drastic action. He believed that Rome might correct itself, that Caesar, secure in power, might loosen his grip, that extraordinary authority might return to ordinary limits. After all, Rome had survived strong men before, but each sign pointed the other way. When Caesar accepted honors that blurred the line between citizen and monarch, it alarmed the Senate. When tribunes were sidelined for symbolic gestures involving crowns, it struck at the heart of republican identity. When Caesar's image and name began to dominate public space, it suggested permanence. Rome was learning to live with one center. For Brutus, this raised an unbearable question. At what point does patience become complicity? His philosophy offered no easy escape. Stoicism demanded action aligned with virtue, not comfort. Platonic ideas about tyranny suggested that allowing unchecked power to solidify was itself immoral. Roman tradition celebrated men who acted decisively in moments of perceived danger. Yet Brutus also understood the cost. Violence, once unleashed, rarely behaves as planned. He had lived through civil war. He knew what chaos looked like. He didn't want bloodshed. He wanted correction. This is why he became obsessed with limits. If action had to be taken, it must be narrow, focused, clean. No purges, no mob violence, no revenge disguised as justice. In his mind, the act must look reluctant, even painful. That mindset didn't stop the momentum. It shaped its form. By now, Brutus was no longer just thinking privately. He was being positioned, by others and by circumstance, as a moral anchor. The conspiracy that would soon take shape needed his restraint as much as it needed his name. Without Brutus, it would look like ambition. With him, it could be framed as duty. This realization weighed heavily on him. To refuse was to risk watching Rome slide further into personal rule. To agree was to step onto a path with no return. And perhaps the most tragic detail of all is this. Brutus didn't believe he was choosing between good and evil. He believed he was choosing between two harms, and that history would punish him whichever path he took. As the city moved closer to the fateful spring of 44 BCE, the air in Rome grew thick with expectation. Decisions were forming, lines were being drawn, not on maps, but in minds. In the next part, we'll see how thought becomes action, how conversation becomes coordination, and how a group of senators convinces itself that a single violent moment can restore a balance that has already slipped away. By the time Brutus accepted that waiting was no longer neutral, something subtle had already shifted inside him. The question was no longer whether Caesar's power posed a danger. The question was whether a man who believed in restraint could justify action without becoming the very thing he feared. This is where the story moves from philosophy into pressure. Rome in early 44 BCE was tense in a way that didn't always show on the surface. Life continued. Courts met. Senators gathered. Festivals were planned. But underneath the routine, there was a shared sense that events were accelerating. Caesar was no longer just first among equals. He was becoming the measure by which everything else was judged. Titles kept accumulating, honors kept arriving. Small gestures, crowns offered, statues adjusted, privileges extended, carried large meanings in a culture obsessed with symbolism. Rome was a city that read signs carefully, and many senators read these signs as warnings. For Brutus, the anxiety wasn't loud. It was steady. He didn't pace the floor or rage in private. He thought. He replayed conversations. He weighed consequences. And slowly, he began to accept an idea that would have once horrified him. That inaction itself could be a form of betrayal. This is where Cassius becomes unavoidable. Cassius had none of Brutus's patience. He had fought Caesar, lost, been forgiven, and returned to Rome simmering with resentment. Caesar's dominance blocked his advancement, bruised his pride, and narrowed his future. Cassius spoke openly about danger, about humiliation, about the shrinking space left for men who still believed the Republic mattered. To Brutus, Cassius's tone felt sharp, sometimes too sharp. But the substance of his argument was harder to dismiss. Cassius didn't speak only of himself. He spoke of precedent, of how Rome slid toward monarchy not through a single declaration, but through repeated acceptance. Their conversations weren't dramatic confrontations. They were careful exchanges, thoughtful, even restrained. Cassius would raise a concern. Brutus would counter with caution. Cassius would remind him of his lineage. Brutus would respond with limits. And that pattern repeated. What changed everything wasn't a single speech or insult. It was the realization that others were already watching Brutus, waiting for him, measuring his silence. In Roman political culture, silence was rarely neutral. When a respected man said nothing, people filled in the meaning themselves. Brutus's refusal to denounce Caesar publicly was read by some as fear, by others as calculation, and by a few as betrayal of everything his family represented. Graffiti appeared in public places, some praising ancient defenders of liberty, others directly addressing Brutus by name. They were not polite reminders. They were provocations. They asked why the descendant of Rome's first tyrant slayer remained quiet while another strongman reshaped the state. Brutus could not ignore this. Reputation mattered in Rome almost as much as law. To be seen as failing one's ancestral duty was a kind of social death. At the same time, Caesar himself remained unaware, or unconcerned, about the depth of the danger. He trusted Brutus. He treated him with respect. He did not exclude him from public life. This trust made everything worse. Because now Brutus wasn't simply considering political violence. He was considering violence against a man who had shown him clemency, confidence, and favor. This is where the psychology becomes painful. Brutus began to frame the problem in increasingly abstract terms. He stopped thinking about Caesar as a person and started thinking about him as a role, as a concentration of power, as a living symbol of a broken balance. This kind of mental shift is common when people prepare themselves for acts they know will haunt them. Turning a person into an idea makes the act feel bearable. Still, Brutus resisted the most extreme proposals. Others suggested killing Caesar's closest allies, especially Antony. From a practical standpoint, this made sense. Remove the center and the supports. Prevent retaliation. End the danger completely. Brutus rejected this firmly. To him, killing Antony would turn the act from correction into slaughter. It would look like a purge, not a defense of law. He insisted that only Caesar must die. No more, no less. This insistence reveals something important. Brutus wanted the act to look morally contained, even if it was violent. He believed that appearances mattered because legitimacy mattered. If the Senate looked like it was cleansing itself of a tyrant, the people might accept it. If it looked like elite revenge, chaos would follow. This belief shaped every part of the plan. The location was chosen carefully. Not a dark street, not a private home. The Senate House itself, a public space tied to law and authority. The message would be clear. This was not murder. This was judgment. The timing mattered too. Caesar was preparing to leave Rome for a major military campaign in the East. Once he left, his power would be even harder to challenge. Armies create loyalty that laws cannot compete with. The window for action was closing fast. And then there was the date. The Ides of March carried ritual weight. It was a day associated with settlements, obligations, and order. That symbolism wasn't accidental. Romans paid attention to calendars in ways modern people often don't. Dates carried memory. Choosing that day was a statement. As the plan took shape, Brutus's role became unavoidable. He was no longer a participant on the edge. He was central. His presence reassured hesitant senators. His approval quieted doubts. His reputation turned whispers into resolve. This didn't bring him peace. Ancient sources suggest that Brutus wrestled internally with the decision, even as the plan advanced. He spoke less. He withdrew. He tried to reconcile his philosophical ideals with the reality of what he was preparing to do. There is a moment, often overlooked, that reveals his mindset clearly. Brutus refused to swear an oath binding the conspirators together. Oaths were common in secret plots. They created unity and commitment. Brutus rejected them because he believed that men acting for the Republic should not need sworn secrecy. They should act openly, guided by conscience. This was noble. It was also naive, because without oaths, the group relied on trust and assumption. And trust, in a moment like this, is fragile. Still, the machinery moved forward. Conversations became coordination. Coordination became expectation. Expectation became inevitability. Brutus crossed an internal threshold somewhere in this process. Not when he agreed to the idea of killing Caesar, but when he accepted responsibility for what would come after. He believed that once the act was done, reason would return, that the Senate would reassert itself, that Rome would remember its habits. This belief reveals how deeply Brutus misunderstood mass psychology. He believed Rome would respond like a classroom corrected by a firm lesson. He underestimated emotion, loyalty, grief, and anger. He overestimated the power of moral explanation. And yet, from inside his mind, the path still felt logical. The Republic, as he understood it, could not survive indefinite concentration of power. Caesar had crossed a line that law alone could not reverse. If Brutus did nothing, he would live comfortably but dishonored. If he acted, he would live or die, with the knowledge that he had tried. That framing is crucial. Brutus did not see himself as choosing violence. He saw himself as choosing sacrifice. By the time the final meeting approached, there was no dramatic turning back, no last-minute revelation, just a quiet acceptance that history had placed him in a role he never sought, but could no longer avoid. In the next part, we will move into that moment itself, not as spectacle, not as legend, but as an event shaped by fear, symbolism, and human miscalculation. The day when philosophy met steel, and the Republic's fate was sealed in a room meant for law, not blood. What Brutus did not anticipate, perhaps could not anticipate, was how quickly restraint can turn into illusion once events begin to move under their own weight. By the time the plan was set, by the time the date and place had been agreed upon, the story had already slipped beyond the careful moral frame Brutus wanted to keep around it. Because while he believed he was acting to protect a system, the system itself had already trained people to respond to power, not principle. The morning of the Ides of March did not feel like the beginning of an ending. Rome woke as it always did. Business continued. People moved through the streets. The city had survived crises before. And yet, beneath the normal rhythm, there was tension, a sense that something important was about to happen, even if most people could not name it. Caesar himself was uneasy. Ancient writers describe warnings, dreams, and whispered concerns. His wife urged him not to go to the Senate that day. A soothsayer had reportedly warned him to beware the Ides. Notes warning of danger may have been handed to him and ignored. Whether all of these details happened exactly as later authors described them matters less than what they reveal about Roman thinking. Romans believed fate spoke through signs. When disaster followed, they looked back and stitched meaning into every coincidence. Caesar hesitated. That hesitation mattered. It shows that even at the height of his power, he was not blind to risk. What tipped the balance was persuasion, not force. Decimus Brutus, one of the conspirators and a man Caesar trusted deeply, convinced him that staying away would look weak, that public duty demanded appearance as much as safety. This detail cuts deep. Caesar died not because he was reckless, but because he still believed in the logic of public life. He believed that showing up mattered. Inside the Senate House, everything happened quickly, and yet not quickly enough to feel clean. The conspirators surrounded Caesar under the pretense of petition. One man seized his toga. That was the signal. Knives followed. Accounts differ on who struck first, how many blows landed, and what Caesar said, if anything. What remains consistent is the chaos. This was not an elegant execution. It was confusion, fear, and violence, compressed into moments that felt far longer to those inside the room. Brutus stepped forward and struck. This is the moment history refuses to let him escape. Not because his blow was unique, but because it symbolized the collapse of every line he had tried to draw. He had wanted a controlled act. What unfolded was something closer to panic wearing the mask of resolve. When it was over, Caesar lay dead at the base of Pompey's statue, an irony that later writers could not resist emphasizing. Blood pooled where debate was supposed to happen. Senators fled, shouting, slipping, abandoning the space that was meant to embody law and order. Brutus tried to speak. This detail appears again and again in ancient sources, and it matters. He stood, bloody dagger in hand, and attempted to address the room. He wanted to explain, to frame the act, to anchor it in principle before emotion took over. No one listened. This is the first brutal sign that Brutus's strategy was failing. He had imagined that reason would follow action. That explanation would calm fear. That legitimacy could be declared and accepted. Instead, the Senate dissolved into terror. From that moment on, the event was no longer under his control. The conspirators regrouped on the Capitoline Hill, holding up their weapons and calling themselves liberators. They believed this display would reassure the city, that Romans would see familiar names and conclude that the Republic had been saved. But Rome was not a room of senators. It was a city of people, and the people did not respond as Brutus expected. At first, there was confusion rather than outrage. Rumors spread faster than facts. Some citizens were unsure what had happened. Others were unsure how to feel. Caesar had been loved by many, but also feared by others. The mood was not instantly explosive. This hesitation gave Brutus hope. He believed there was still time to shape the narrative. He addressed the people, emphasizing liberty, law, and the end of tyranny. Among the elite, this message found some support. Senators who had quietly resented Caesar nodded along. They wanted to believe that this act could restore familiar patterns. But when the message reached the broader population, the reaction shifted. Ordinary Romans did not live inside abstract constitutional theory. They lived inside daily realities. Grain supply, jobs, stability. Caesar had mattered to them not as a concept, but as a presence. This difference in perspective would become fatal. Brutus underestimated how much Caesar's popularity had reshaped Roman political life. He believed that once the tyrant was gone, the system would reassert itself. He did not fully grasp that Caesar had become the system for many people. The turning point came with Caesar's funeral. Brutus allowed it to happen. More than that, he agreed to let Antony speak. This decision is often described as his greatest mistake, and for good reason. But it is worth understanding why he made it. Brutus believed in process. He believed in fairness. Denying Caesar a public funeral would look unjust. Silencing Antony would look tyrannical. Brutus wanted the new order to begin cleanly, without the stain of suppression. Once again, his moral instincts clashed with political reality. Antony understood crowds in a way Brutus never did. He knew how to pace emotion, how to shift tone, how to use symbols. He did not argue abstractly. He showed Caesar's wounds. He read the will. He spoke of generosity, of shared loss, of betrayal not of law, but of a man. When Antony read that Caesar had left money to the people in public spaces for their enjoyment, the crowd's confusion hardened into anger. This was not a tyrant hoarding wealth. This was a leader who had remembered them. The city erupted. The conspirators' carefully constructed image shattered in moments. The crowd did not see liberators. They saw killers. The same daggers that had been raised as symbols of freedom now looked like instruments of treachery. Brutus and Cassius fled Rome soon after. This flight was not cowardice. It was recognition. They no longer controlled events. Staying would have meant arrest, violence, or death. The republic they thought they had saved was not rallying to them. It was recoiling. This is where the deeper tragedy of Brutus's plan becomes clear. He had believed that removing Caesar would remove the pressure. Instead, it released it. Caesar's death did not restore balance. It removed the one figure holding competing forces in check. Power abhors a vacuum. Rome rushed to fill it. Antony moved quickly. Octavian, Caesar's adopted heir, entered the scene with a name that carried enormous weight. Alliances shifted. Promises hardened into threats. The political landscape transformed almost overnight. Brutus watched this unfold from a distance, and the realization must have been crushing. The act meant to prevent civil war had made it inevitable. The Republic had not been rescued. It had been exposed. And yet, even here, Brutus did not abandon his sense of duty. He did not fade into obscurity or seek quiet exile. He raised armies. He gathered resources. He prepared to fight, not for personal power, but for what he still believed the Republic represented. This is where the story refuses easy judgment. Brutus had misread people, emotion, and momentum. He had overestimated the power of moral explanation and underestimated the pull of loyalty. But he had not acted lightly. He had acted from a belief that unchecked power corrodes everything it touches. The cost of that belief was now unavoidable. As Rome slid back into war, Brutus carried the weight of a choice that could no longer be undone. The knives had done their work, but they had not delivered the future he imagined. In the next part, we will follow Brutus eastward, away from Rome and into the machinery of war, where ideals would be tested not in speeches or symbols, but in supply lines, armies, and decisions made far from the Senate floor. Brutus left Rome with the sound of it still echoing in his head. Not the cheers he had hoped for, but the roar of a crowd that had turned against him, the crackle of fires lit in anger, the realization that the city he thought he understood no longer spoke the same political language he did. Moving east was not just a retreat. It was a recalibration. In Roman politics, distance did not mean irrelevance. The provinces were where power gathered quietly. Armies were raised there. Money was collected there. Loyalties were built there. Brutus understood this. If the Republic was to have any chance at survival, it would not be saved in speeches delivered in the Forum. It would be decided far from Rome, where legions listened to commanders more than crowds listened to orators. The Eastern Mediterranean had long been Rome's pressure valve. Greece, Macedonia, Asia Minor. These regions were culturally rich, strategically vital, and politically flexible. Roman elites stationed there could act with more freedom than in the capital, where every move was watched, judged, and distorted. When Brutus arrived in Greece, he found something he had not felt in Rome for months: respect without immediate hostility. Young Roman aristocrats studying in Athens welcomed him warmly. Greek cities, steeped in philosophical tradition, were more receptive to his language of liberty and virtue. Here, his Stoic tone didn't sound detached. It sounded appropriate. This reception reinforced his belief that he was still on the right side of history. But ideals alone do not feed armies. Brutus quickly discovered that defending the Republic required resources, money, ships, soldiers, and supplies. And acquiring those resources forced him into choices that looked disturbingly similar to the practices he had once criticized. Cities were pressured to contribute. Wealth was extracted. Resistance was punished. Ancient accounts differ in how harsh Brutus's actions were, but even the most sympathetic sources admit that force was used. In places like Xanthus, violence escalated beyond what Brutus likely intended. Some historians describe devastation and enslavement. Others soften the picture, emphasizing regret and restraint. Both versions can be true. War compresses ethics. Decisions made to serve a cause can produce outcomes that contradict that cause. Brutus, the man who wanted to prevent tyranny, now commanded troops who enforced compliance. The republic he was fighting for was increasingly sustained by coercion. This is where the irony sharpens. To resist centralized power, Brutus had to exercise it. Meanwhile, events in Rome were moving fast. Antony, Octavian, and Lepidus formed what became known as the Second Triumvirate. This was not an informal alliance like the first. It was legally sanctioned, ruthless, and efficient. Its purpose was clear: eliminate enemies and secure control. The prescriptions that followed were brutal. Names were posted, property was seized, lives were taken. Cicero, the great orator and one of the Republic's most vocal defenders, was killed. His death sent a message that words alone would no longer shape Rome's future. For Brutus, this confirmed his fears and deepened his resolve. The Republic was not just weakened, it was being dismantled. He joined forces with Cassius, who had been gathering strength in Syria. Together, they commanded a formidable force. Their combined armies rivaled those of the triumvirs. They controlled vast territory and resources. On paper, they had a real chance. But unity on paper does not guarantee unity in spirit. Brutus and Cassius were allies, not twins. Cassius remained driven by resentment and urgency. Brutus remained guided by principle and caution. They disagreed on tactics, timing, and severity. Cassius was willing to be harsh if it meant efficiency. Brutus preferred restraint even when it slowed momentum. Their differences didn't break the alliance, but they strained it. As they prepared for confrontation, Brutus continued to believe that legitimacy mattered. He paid his troops generously, understanding that loyalty in wartime often follows compensation. He maintained discipline, discouraged excess cruelty where possible, and tried to frame their campaign as lawful resistance rather than rebellion. And yet, the machinery of war cares little for framing. When the opposing forces finally moved toward each other in Macedonia, near the city of Philippi, the stakes were no longer abstract. This was no longer about speeches or symbols. This was about survival. The armies faced each other across difficult terrain. Supply lines were stretched. Morale fluctuated. Each side knew that defeat would mean not negotiation, but annihilation. The first clash did not produce a clean outcome. Brutus's forces performed well against Octavian's troops, even capturing his camp. At the same time, Cassius's wing struggled against Antony. In the confusion, Cassius received incomplete information. Believing the battle lost, he took his own life. This moment shattered Brutus. Cassius had been difficult, sharp, and relentless, but he had also been essential. His death left Brutus in sole command, carrying not only the weight of leadership, but the guilt of survival. Once again, a man committed to restraint found himself surrounded by irreversible loss. Brutus addressed his troops with calm resolve. He promised rewards. He praised courage. He maintained order. Outwardly, he appeared steady. Inwardly, the cracks were widening. The second confrontation at Philippi came weeks later. This time, there was no ambiguity. Antony's forces broke through. Brutus's army collapsed. The fight was over. Brutus escaped into the hills with a small group of loyal followers. Night fell. The sounds of defeat settled around him. And in that quiet, the full weight of his journey pressed down. He had killed Caesar to prevent civil war. Civil war had followed anyway. He had fought to save the Republic. The Republic was gone. He had tried to act with restraint. Violence had multiplied. In Roman culture, there was still one decision left that a defeated noble could make. Brutus chose death. Ancient sources describe his final moments as composed. He spoke to friends. He thanked them. He urged them to save themselves. And then he fell on his sword. This act has been interpreted in many ways: cowardice by some, honor by others. For Romans of his class, it was neither unusual nor shameful. It was a final assertion of control in a world that had stripped him of it. Antony, when he found Brutus's body, reportedly treated it with respect. He ordered it wrapped in fine cloth and sent the ashes to Brutus's mother. This gesture matters. It suggests that even enemies recognized the seriousness of Brutus's intent. With Brutus's death, the Republican cause effectively ended. Octavian would soon defeat Antony and emerge as Augustus, Rome's first emperor. The Republic. Brutus had tried to preserve would survive only in name, folded neatly into a system it once claimed to oppose. And this is the bitterest irony of all. Brutus believed he was acting to stop one-man rule. His actions removed the last obstacle to it. In the final part, we will step back from the events and ask the uncomfortable question that has followed Brutus for centuries. Was he wrong because he failed, or because the world he tried to save no longer existed? After Brutus's death, the noise of war slowly gave way to something quieter but more enduring. Interpretation. Battles end. Bodies are buried. But meanings keep moving, and in Brutus's case, meaning became the real battlefield. Rome did not pause to mourn him for long. Power rarely waits. Octavian moved with discipline and patience, reshaping the state without calling it monarchy. The Senate still met. Magistracies still existed. Old language remained in place. But the center of gravity had shifted for good. Authority no longer flowed upward from shared custom. It flowed outward from one man. In that new order, Brutus became inconvenient. The winners of history decide which stories are useful. Brutus's story was dangerous because it asked an uncomfortable question. If killing Caesar was it wrong because it failed, or because it was morally flawed from the start? The empire preferred a simpler answer. Brutus became the cautionary example, the man who broke peace, the traitor who plunged Rome back into chaos. And yet, the story refused to settle. Writers struggled with him. Plutarch, writing generations later, treated Brutus with surprising care. He described his seriousness, his restraint, his internal conflict. He did not present him as a monster. Appian, more focused on the mechanics of war, showed Brutus as a commander forced into harsh choices. Cassius Dio emphasized the consequences, often reading the assassination as reckless and destabilizing. Cicero's letters, written closer to the events, reveal admiration mixed with frustration, sympathy tangled with doubt. These sources do not agree, and that disagreement is revealing. Brutus sits at the intersection of competing moral frameworks. In one frame, loyalty is sacred. Killing a benefactor is unforgivable. In another frame, liberty outweighs personal bonds. In that logic, friendship becomes secondary to public duty. Rome itself never fully resolved this tension, which is why Brutus continued to haunt its imagination. Then came Shakespeare. When Shakespeare wrote Julius Caesar, he did something extraordinary. He shifted the moral center of the story away from Caesar and toward Brutus. Caesar becomes almost static, a presence more than a person, while Brutus becomes the emotional core. He is thoughtful, hesitant, earnest, trapped by conscience. The noblest, Roman of them all. That line did not come from ancient Rome. It came from Elizabethan England. And yet it stuck because it captured something many readers sensed but struggled to articulate. Brutus was not driven by hunger for power. He was driven by fear of what power could become. Shakespeare's Brutus is wrong, but he is sincere. He is doomed not by cruelty, but by misjudgment. He believes people will respond to reason. He believes legitimacy can be spoken into existence. He believes that explaining an act will make it acceptable. History punishes that belief relentlessly. But Shakespeare also ensured that Brutus would never be remembered as a simple villain. He became tragic, and tragedy has staying power. Over time, Brutus's name escaped Rome entirely and entered political philosophy. Enlightenment thinkers debated him. Revolutionaries cited him. Tyrannicide, the killing of a ruler for the sake of freedom, became a serious topic rather than a taboo one. Was violence justified if it prevented greater harm? Could killing one man save many, or did it always poison the cause it claimed to serve? Brutus became a case study. Some argued that he acted too soon, before Caesar revealed open kingship. Others argued that he acted too late, after Caesar's popularity made backlash inevitable. Some claimed the Republic was already dead, and Brutus merely refused to accept reality. Others insisted that accepting reality too easily is how freedom erodes. Each generation found its own reflection in him. In modern times, Brutus appears whenever societies wrestle with emergency powers, charismatic leaders, and the fear that temporary authority might harden into permanence. His story resurfaces during constitutional crises, debates over executive overreach, and moments when legality and legitimacy pull apart. And yet, for all this discussion, one detail often gets lost. Brutus did not live in a stable democracy. He lived in a state already shaped by violence. Rome's republic had survived by force as often as by law. Generals had marched on the city before Caesar. Political enemies had been killed before the Ides of March. Brutus did not introduce blood into politics. He inherited it. What made his act different was symbolism. By striking Caesar in the Senate, Brutus turned political violence into a statement about law itself. He meant to say that no one stood above the Republic. What the act actually said, whether he intended it or not, was that the Republic could no longer protect itself without murder. That is a devastating admission. And here is the controversial thought that refuses to go away. Brutus may have been right about Caesar, but wrong about Rome. The republic he wanted to save relied on habits that no longer held. It required elite restraint in a culture that rewarded dominance. It required shared belief in limits in a system that had already learned how to bypass them. It required patience from a population that had tasted stability under strong leadership. In that sense, Brutus wasn't battling Caesar alone. He was battling time. History does not move kindly around men who try to reverse its direction. Even when they are sincere, even when they are intelligent, even when they are morally serious. Brutus's tragedy is not that he failed. It is that success, as he defined it, may no longer have been possible. If Caesar had lived, Rome would likely have become an empire anyway, perhaps more slowly, perhaps more openly, perhaps under a different name. By killing him, Brutus did not stop that transformation. He accelerated it, clarified it, and stripped it of ambiguity. And yet, to dismiss Brutus as foolish is too easy. He reminds us that political systems do not collapse only because of bad actors. They collapse because people stop believing in them enough to endure their limits. Brutus believed too fiercely, too literally, in a republic that had already become a memory wrapped in ceremony. That belief made him dangerous. It also made him human. Because when institutions weaken, individuals are forced to decide what they owe the past, what they owe the present, and what they owe the future. Brutus chose the past. Caesar chose the present. Octavian mastered the future. History rewarded the one who understood timing best. In the final part, we will step back even further and ask the question that still unsettles people centuries later. Was Brutus a warning or a mirror? And what does his failure say about the moments when law, loyalty, and fear collide in any age, not just ancient Rome? If Brutus has lingered this long in human memory, it isn't because of what he did with his hands. It's because of what his story does to our thinking. Long after the Republic vanished, long after emperors ruled without pretending otherwise, Brutus remained uncomfortably relevant. That alone should tell us something. Most historical figures fade once their context disappears. Brutus did not. He kept resurfacing because his dilemma never fully went away. He stands at the fault line between loyalty and law, between personal bonds and abstract principles, between patience and intervention. Every society that fears concentrated power eventually finds itself circling the same questions Brutus faced. Was Caesar a tyrant in the making, or a stabilizer in a collapsing system? Was violence a cure or a symptom? And perhaps most unsettling of all, how do you tell the difference while you're living inside the moment? In political theory, Brutus becomes a test case. Philosophers arguing about justified resistance return to him again and again because his motives resist simplification. He did not act to gain power. He acted to remove it. That alone separates him from most conspirators in history. And yet, the outcome was catastrophic. This creates a moral paradox that refuses to resolve neatly. If Brutus had succeeded, if the Senate had reasserted itself, if civil war had been avoided, if Rome had stabilized, he might be remembered today as a hero of liberty. The same act that made him infamous would have been framed as necessary. History often judges intentions through outcomes, but outcomes are not always fair judges. Modern political thinkers have wrestled with this tension. Some argue that Brutus acted prematurely before Caesar crossed a clear line into monarchy. Others argue the opposite, that he acted too late after Caesar's popularity made resistance politically suicidal. These opposing critiques reveal something important. Brutus was operating in a gray zone where certainty was impossible. He had no proof that Caesar would declare himself king. He also had no guarantee that Caesar would step back. All he had was trajectory, direction, momentum. And momentum is hard to stop without force. This is where the ethics of political violence become especially uncomfortable. Many societies claim to reject violence outright, yet quietly depend on the threat of it to maintain order. Laws are enforced because consequences exist. Revolutions succeed not because they are peaceful, but because they are decisive. Brutus believed that one contained act could prevent larger bloodshed. That belief has motivated countless political actors since. Sometimes it works, often it doesn't. The tragedy of Brutus is that his act did not stay contained. Violence rarely does. Once Caesar fell, restraint became a weakness. Antony exploited emotion. Octavian exploited legitimacy. Lepidus exploited fear. The Republic's language survived, but its spirit did not. Brutus had removed the keystone without realizing how much weight it carried. And yet, blaming Brutus alone misses a deeper truth. The Republic had been hollowed out long before the Ides of March. Elections were distorted by money. Offices were blocked by influence. Armies answered to generals, not institutions. Brutus did not create these conditions. He inherited them. In that sense, his failure was structural. He believed the Republic could be restored through a symbolic reset. He underestimated how much political life had already shifted away from symbols toward loyalty and control. Rome had changed its instincts. Brutus was appealing to habits that no longer guided behavior. This mismatch between moral logic and social reality is what makes his story echo across time. Think of how often modern societies cling to constitutional language while power operates elsewhere. Think of how often leaders justify extraordinary authority as temporary. Think of how often people accept those justifications because stability feels safer than uncertainty. Brutus's error was not ignorance, it was faith. Faith that explanation could overcome emotion. Faith that legitimacy could be declared rather than earned. Faith that institutions could snap back into shape once pressure was released. History suggests otherwise. Institutions, once bent far enough, do not straighten easily. They require sustained belief, not just dramatic gestures. Brutus offered a gesture. His opponents offered continuity of control. Continuity usually wins. And yet, there is a reason Brutus still unsettles people who study power. He reminds us that not all threats arrive wearing crowns. Some arrive wrapped in relief. Some arrive promising order. Some arrive carrying the exhausted hopes of people who are tired of chaos. Caesar may not have intended to become a king, but intention matters less than structure. When one man becomes indispensable, the system has already failed. Brutus sensed that. He just misjudged how far failure had progressed. In literature, this misjudgment becomes tragic flaw. In politics, it becomes miscalculation. In human terms, it becomes regret. That is why later generations could never fully condemn Brutus, even when they condemned his act. He forces us to confront a truth we prefer to avoid. Sometimes the choice is not between right and wrong, but between two futures you dislike for different reasons. Brutus chose the future where tyranny was resisted, even if chaos followed. Octavian chose the future where chaos was ended, even if liberty quietly disappeared. Rome chose the future that felt survivable. And history followed Rome. As centuries passed, emperors ruled with less pretense. The Republic became a memory recited in schools and honored in language, but not revived in practice. Yet Brutus's name remained alive. Not because he won, but because he asked the question no empire once asked. When does order become submission? That question has no expiration date. In the final part, we will bring all of this together. Not to settle the debate around Brutus, but to sit with it. To consider why his failure still matters, why his reasoning still attracts defenders, and why his story remains a quiet warning for any society that believes power can be trusted simply because it feels necessary. Long after the dust of Philippi settled and Rome adjusted itself to imperial rule, something curious happened. Brutus did not disappear. Other defeated figures faded into footnotes, their names recalled only by specialists. Brutus lingered. He lingered in plays, essays, speeches, revolutions, and quiet arguments between people trying to decide how far loyalty should stretch when power concentrates. That persistence is not accidental. Brutus survived because his story fits too many situations too well. Whenever a society fears that law is being hollowed out from the inside, his name rises again. Whenever a leader gathers extraordinary authority and insists it is temporary, Brutus re-enters the conversation. Whenever people argue about whether resistance should wait or act, he stands uncomfortably in the middle. What makes him so difficult to dismiss is that he never wanted to rule. History is filled with ambitious men who justify violence as a step toward power. Brutus does the opposite. He destroys power and then steps away from it. That alone confuses the usual moral categories. If he were selfish, his story would be simpler. If he were cruel, it would be easier to condemn him. But Brutus believed he was limiting power, not claiming it. This belief places him in a rare position in political thought. Later writers struggled to classify him. Was he a patriot who failed, or a moral purist who misunderstood politics? Was he courageous for acting, or reckless for acting without popular support? Every answer seems incomplete because Brutus sits at the fault line between ethical intention and political outcome. Roman authors themselves were divided. Some framed him as a man led astray by philosophy, someone who applied abstract ideals to a world that no longer operated that way. Others treated him with quiet respect, emphasizing his seriousness, his refusal to enrich himself excessively, and his attempts to restrain violence even during war. What almost all agreed on, however, was that his act changed everything. Before Caesar's death, Rome still existed in a state of suspended ambiguity. The Republic was damaged, but it was recognizable. After the Ides of March, ambiguity vanished. Lines hardened, compromise collapsed. The choice became stark: side with the killers or side with Caesar's legacy. Most people chose legacy. This choice reveals something Brutus never fully accepted. Political systems are not sustained by logic alone. They are sustained by emotional investment. Caesar had cultivated that investment carefully. He paid veterans. He entertained the public. He remembered names. He projected confidence during chaos. People trusted him not because he followed rules, but because he made life feel manageable. Brutus offered something very different. He offered restoration of a system that many Romans experienced as distant, elite, and slow. He spoke of liberty, but liberty felt abstract compared to grain, jobs, and safety. This mismatch doomed his message. In this sense, Brutus was not outplayed intellectually. He was outpaced socially. He tried to restore a republic that no longer commanded affection. Rome had changed what it wanted from power, even if it hadn't admitted that change openly. Octavian understood this instinctively. Unlike Brutus, Octavian did not argue against Caesar's accumulation of authority. He embraced it, softened it, and renamed it. He preserved republican language while emptying it of force. The Senate still met. Laws were still passed. but decisions flowed from one center. This subtlety made resistance nearly impossible. Octavian did not ask Rome to abandon its identity. He allowed it to pretend continuity while accepting transformation. Brutus, by contrast, demanded a return to a past that required discipline, restraint, and shared belief. Shared belief is fragile. Once it erodes, it cannot be restored by force alone. This is why Brutus's legacy is not simply about failure, it is about timing. He sensed danger accurately. He misjudged readiness. The republic he defended existed more in memory than in practice. Its institutions had survived, but its habits had weakened. Its language remained, but its authority had thinned. Brutus treated symptoms as if they were causes. He believed removing Caesar would remove the problem. What he removed instead was the last figure capable of holding a fragmented system together long enough to transform it smoothly. The transformation still happened, but violently and without republican illusions. Later generations would argue endlessly about whether this made Brutus tragic or foolish. The more honest answer may be that it made him both sincere and wrong. That combination is unsettling because it offers no comfort. We like our historical villains to be malicious and our heroes to be effective. Brutus is neither. He is sincere and ineffective. His moral clarity did not translate into political success. His refusal to compromise limited his ability to shape outcomes. And yet, that refusal is precisely what makes people admire him. He reminds us that political compromise has moral costs, even when it stabilizes societies. Octavian brought peace, but it came with obedience. Brutus rejected obedience, but brought war. Rome chose peace. History often does. Brutus's name later became shorthand for betrayal, but that says more about cultural memory than about his intent. Betrayal is easier to teach than moral ambiguity. A single phrase, et tu, Brute, is easier to remember than a lifetime of reasoning, doubt, and fear. That phrase turned him into a symbol, stripping away context. Symbols travel faster than nuance. Yet even as the simplified image spread, thinkers kept returning to the more complicated version. During periods of political upheaval, Brutus was cited not as a traitor, but as a warning. A reminder that legality without legitimacy invites crisis. A reminder that power justified by necessity can quietly become permanent. In this way, Brutus became a mirror rather than a lesson. People did not look at him to learn what to do. They looked at him to examine their own anxieties. Was authority expanding too far? Were institutions becoming decorative? Was patience still a virtue, or had it become complicity? These questions resurfaced again and again in contexts far removed from Rome. Brutus's story also exposes a deeper discomfort about political violence. Many societies claim to reject it, yet they quietly accept it when it feels stabilizing. Brutus used violence to resist concentration of power. Octavian used violence to consolidate it. One is often condemned. The other is often excused as necessary. Outcomes shape memory. If Brutus had won, the moral verdict would be different. That reality should trouble us. It suggests that history rewards success more than sincerity, effectiveness more than intention. Brutus forces us to ask whether moral action should be judged by outcome alone. He also forces us to confront a harsher truth. Sometimes systems do not fail because no one resisted, but because resistance arrived after belief had faded. The Republic needed defenders long before Brutus raised his hand. By the time he acted, the emotional center of Rome had shifted elsewhere. He was guarding a structure whose foundations had already eroded. This does not make his effort meaningless. It makes it tragic. Because tragedy is not about bad people doing bad things. It is about serious people making irreversible choices in imperfect conditions. Brutus was serious. He was thoughtful. He was wrong. And yet, the discomfort he leaves behind is valuable. He reminds us that not every collapse is sudden, not every danger announces itself loudly, and not every attempt to stop decline succeeds. He also reminds us that acting too late can be just as damaging as acting too soon. In the final part, we will pull away from Rome entirely and look at Brutus from the wettest possible angle, not as a Roman senator, not as Caesar's killer, but as a recurring figure in human history. A reminder that when systems weaken, individuals are forced into impossible choices, and that the line between protector and destroyer is thinner than anyone wants to admit. By the time Rome had fully settled into imperial rhythm, Brutus no longer threatened anyone. He was dead. His followers were gone. The Republic existed only as language. And yet, long after the danger had passed, Rome still seemed uneasy around his memory. That unease is revealing. Empires are comfortable remembering enemies they defeat on the battlefield. They are far less comfortable remembering enemies who acted in the name of principles the empire still claims to respect. Brutus did not oppose Rome. He opposed what Rome was becoming. And that distinction made him difficult to place neatly into the moral filing system of imperial history. Official memory leaned toward simplification. Brutus became the traitor, the man who murdered a benefactor, the ingrate who plunged the world back into war. This version was useful. It warned against resistance. It reinforced the idea that stability, once achieved, should not be disturbed. But memory is never controlled by authority alone. Alongside the official story, another version of Brutus continued to circulate quietly. This Brutus was not celebrated loudly, but he was not forgotten either. He appeared in private reading, philosophical discussion, and later in literature. He became a figure people argued about rather than agreed upon. That alone gave him longevity. One reason for this is that Brutus never fit the usual mold of a failed rebel. He did not enrich himself. He did not crown himself. He did not establish a rival regime. Even after Caesar's death, he spoke about restoring shared rule rather than claiming authority. When he controlled territory in the East, he did not attempt to found a new state. He prepared for a return to Rome, not a replacement of it. This restraint complicated judgment. Roman culture valued ambition, but it also distrusted naked hunger for power. Brutus appeared to act against his own interest, and that confused people. Even those who believed he was wrong sensed that his motivations were not cheap. This is why later thinkers could reinterpret him. During periods of political reflection, Brutus became a reference point rather than a verdict. Writers did not ask whether he was good or evil. They asked whether he was justified, mistaken, or tragically out of step with his time. Political philosophers debating resistance to tyranny found him unavoidable. He represented the hardest case. It is easy to condemn violence motivated by greed. It is much harder to dismiss violence motivated by fear of permanent domination. Brutus's story also exposed an uncomfortable reality about institutions. Systems do not collapse the moment someone breaks a rule. They collapse when people stop believing that rules protect them. By the time Caesar was killed, many Romans already felt that protection had shifted from law to leadership. Brutus sensed this shift, but misread its implications. He believed that removing the leader would restore faith in the system. In reality, the system had already lost emotional authority. People trusted Caesar not because he was lawful, but because he felt reliable. Reliability, once tasted, is difficult to surrender. This is where Brutus's thinking collided with social psychology. He assumed that people would value principle over continuity. He assumed that outrage at concentrated power would outweigh grief and fear. He assumed that explanation would calm emotion. These assumptions were not irrational. They were just incomplete. Human communities rarely respond to shock by embracing abstraction. They respond by clinging to what feels familiar. After Caesar's death, what felt familiar was not the Senate. It was Caesar's presence, his image, his legacy. Octavian understood this. He did not argue against Brutus's ideals. He bypassed them. He positioned himself as continuity embodied. He wrapped change in reassurance. He allowed Rome to believe it was preserving tradition while quietly accepting transformation. Brutus offered disruption followed by hope. Octavian offered stability followed by adjustment. Stability usually wins. This does not mean Brutus was foolish. It means he underestimated the depth of Rome's exhaustion. The Republic demanded active participation, patience, and restraint from its elites. After decades of war, corruption, and crisis, many Romans no longer wanted to manage power. They wanted power managed for them. Brutus did not accept that desire. He saw it as dangerous. He was likely right. But being right about danger does not guarantee support for resistance. This tension makes Brutus uncomfortable for modern audiences as well. His story forces us to confront the possibility that societies sometimes trade liberty not because they are coerced, but because they are tired. That idea undermines simple narratives of oppression and heroism. It also complicates how we judge political violence. Brutus believed that one act could halt a larger transformation. History suggests the opposite. Transformations driven by social appetite rarely stop when a single individual is removed. They adapt, they continue, they find new carriers. Caesar was not unique in his ambition. He was unique in his timing. When he fell, others were ready to step into the space he left. The structure that allowed his rise remained intact. Brutus attacked the symptom, not the condition. This insight reshaped how later generations viewed resistance. The lesson many drew was not never resist, but understand what you are resisting. Power is not only personal, it is cultural. It lives in expectations, habits, and fears. Killing a leader does not kill the forces that made the leader necessary. Brutus's failure thus became instructive. It warned that moral clarity without strategic understanding can be self-defeating. It suggested that defending institutions requires more than dramatic gestures. It requires rebuilding trust, addressing inequality, and offering alternatives that feel livable. Brutus offered a return. His opponents offered a future. People tend to choose the future, even when it costs them something they will miss later. This is why Brutus remains relevant. He represents the moment when a society realizes too late that the system it assumed was permanent has already changed. He acts not at the beginning of decline, but near its end, when choices are narrower and consequences sharper. In that sense, Brutus is not a model to imitate or reject outright. He is a warning about timing, belief, and the limits of moral action in political life. He reminds us that courage alone is not enough. Intention alone is not enough. Even virtue, when misaligned with social reality, can produce catastrophe. And yet, without people like Brutus, history would be poorer. Because he forces us to ask questions that success prefers to silence. He asks whether stability justifies obedience, whether peace excuses concentration of power, whether legality matters when legitimacy fades. These questions do not die with empires, they migrate. In the final part, we will step fully outside Rome and consider Brutus as a recurring figure across history and human behavior. Not as a Roman, but as a pattern. A reminder that when systems weaken and authority hardens, individuals face choices that no rulebook can resolve, and that the cost of choosing either way is never small. By the end of Brutus's life, nothing looked the way he thought it would. The republic he acted to preserve did not rise again. The violence he hoped would be contained multiplied. The moral clarity he trusted dissolved into confusion, grief, and war. If history were a courtroom, the verdict would seem obvious. And yet, Brutus refuses to stay convicted. He lingers because his failure does not feel empty. It feels instructive, uncomfortable, familiar. Brutus did not misunderstand power in a simple way. He understood its danger. What he misunderstood was how deeply people had already accepted it. He believed the Republic still lived in the habits of its citizens. In truth, it survived mostly in memory. Its language remained, its rituals continued, but its emotional authority had drained away long before Caesar fell. This is the hardest truth in his story. Systems do not die when they are attacked. They die when they are no longer felt as necessary. Brutus acted as if Rome still wanted restraint, shared rule, and collective responsibility. Many Romans did not. They wanted predictability. They wanted safety. They wanted someone else to carry the burden of decision. Caesar offered that. Octavian perfected it. Brutus offered responsibility. History tells us which offer wins more often. This does not make Brutus foolish. It makes him early in one sense and late in another. Early in recognizing the danger of concentrated power. Late in understanding that belief in the old system had already eroded beyond repair. He was trying to restore a structure without restoring the faith that once held it together. That mismatch is why his story still stings. Because it suggests that even correct warnings can fail if they arrive after trust has shifted. It suggests that liberty is not lost only through force, but through fatigue. It suggests that people sometimes trade participation for relief and only realize the cost when participation is no longer available. Brutus forces us to confront a disturbing possibility that moral action, taken sincerely, can still accelerate the outcome it seeks to prevent. He did not create the empire, but his act removed the last obstacle to its clean arrival. By breaking the illusion of shared rule in one violent moment, he cleared the path for a system that no longer pretended otherwise. In that sense, Brutus did not end the Republic by betraying it. He ended it by proving it could no longer protect itself. And here is the controversial thought that history rarely says aloud. Brutus may have been necessary, not because he succeeded, but because he revealed the truth. He exposed the Republic's weakness in a way speeches never could. He showed that when institutions rely on personal virtue rather than shared belief, they collapse the moment virtue acts alone. This is why Brutus remains a warning rather than a lesson. He does not tell us what to do. He tells us what happens when action arrives without alignment between ideals and social reality. He reminds us that killing a symbol does not kill a system, and that defending law requires more than courage at the point of crisis. Most of all, he reminds us that history does not reward sincerity. It rewards timing. Caesar understood the present. Octavian understood the future. Brutus clung to the past, not out of nostalgia, but out of conviction that the past still mattered. That conviction cost him everything. And yet, without people like Brutus, history would slide forward without resistance, without reflection, without anyone willing to ask whether stability is worth obedience, or whether peace justifies silence. Brutus lost. But the question he raised did not. Every age eventually produces its own version of him. A figure standing between loyalty and law, between patience and action, between comfort and conscience. And every age must decide whether it still believes in the systems it claims to defend, or whether it has already accepted their replacement. Brutus's life does not offer reassurance. It offers recognition. Sometimes the most dangerous moment for a society is not when power is seized, but when no one truly believes it can be shared anymore. That was Brutus's world, and when you listen closely, it may not sound as distant as it should. And that brings us to the end of tonight's story. Marcus Junius. Brutus did not live long enough to see how Rome would remember him. He never heard his name become shorthand for betrayal. He never saw emperors rule in the open. He never watched the Republic turn into memory rather than practice. All he knew was that he acted when he believed the moment demanded it, and that history did not bend the way he hoped. Whether Brutus was right or wrong is a question people have been arguing about for centuries, and perhaps that argument itself is the point. His life sits in the uneasy space where good intentions meet irreversible consequences, where loyalty clashes with law, and where fear of the future reshapes the present. If there's anything his story leaves behind, it's not certainty, but reflection. About power, about patience, about how systems fade long before they fall, and how difficult it is to know when action protects something or finally breaks it. Thank you for spending this time with me. If you found this story meaningful, you're welcome to like, subscribe, or share your thoughts in the comments. And if you'd like to support the channel, you'll find links below. For now, take a breath, let the past settle, and rest well.